Ukraine's counteroffensive has been one of the most significant military developments in the ongoing war with Russia. Since Russia's invasion in February 2022, Ukraine has defied expectations and mounted a defense that has surprised military analysts around the world. The latest counteroffensive, initiated in 2023, aims to regain occupied territories and push back Russian forces on multiple fronts. This video will break down Ukraine's recent counteroffensive moves, explore their strategic impact, and analyze how these developments are shaping the battlefield. Part 1. Background and prelude to the counteroffensive. Before diving into the specifics of Ukraine's counteroffensive, it's essential to understand the broader context that led to this critical phase of the war. In the early months of the invasion, Russia launched a large-scale assault targeting Kyiv, Kharkiv, and other major Ukrainian cities. Despite being outgunned and outnumbered, Ukrainian forces, buoyed by international support, managed to halt Russia's advances, leading to a more static, trench warfare-like front in certain areas by late 2022. Through the winter and spring of 2023, Ukraine faced a difficult challenge, preparing for a counteroffensive to regain its territory. The Ukrainian military leadership, supported by intelligence and Western-supplied arms, planned meticulously for a summer push that would exploit weaknesses in Russia's defensive lines. Ukraine's strategy was designed around several key goals: breaking Russian supply lines, reclaiming key urban centers, and weakening Russia's military presence in Crimea and the Donbas. Part 2. Initial counteroffensive strikes, Zaporizhzhia, Kherson, and Donetsk. Ukraine's counteroffensive in 2023 began with attacks along the southern front, particularly in the Zaporizhzhia and Kherson regions. These areas were chosen strategically for their geographic and logistical significance. The Ukrainian military aimed to cut off the so-called land bridge that connects Russian-controlled territories in eastern Ukraine with Crimea, a critical supply route for Russian forces. In the Zaporizhzhia region, Ukraine launched a concerted effort to breach Russia's deeply entrenched defensive lines. This included attacks aimed at weakening Russian artillery positions and disrupting logistics centers that were keeping the Russian forces supplied. The offensive also saw the introduction of Western-supplied weapons like the M142 HIMARS, which allowed Ukraine to strike deep behind Russian lines, causing significant disruptions. Kherson, which had been partially liberated by Ukrainian forces in late 2022, remained a contested area. Ukraine's counteroffensive in the Kherson region aimed to expand control over the Dnipro River and to create a buffer zone that would make it more difficult for Russian forces to launch artillery strikes against Ukrainian-controlled cities. This part of the counteroffensive sought to establish a stronger Ukrainian presence along the river while preventing Russian reinforcements from solidifying their positions. In Donetsk, Ukraine launched probing attacks designed to tie down Russian forces and prevent them from reinforcing the southern front. By maintaining pressure in the Donbas, Ukrainian commanders hoped to stretch Russian resources, creating opportunities for breakthroughs elsewhere. The fighting in Donetsk remained intense, with both sides suffering significant casualties, but the Ukrainian strategy aimed to create multiple points of pressure on the Russian front lines. Part 3. The role of combined arms operations. One of the defining features of Ukraine's 2023 counteroffensive has been the use of combined arms operations. This tactical approach involves the coordination of infantry, armor, artillery, and air support to create a more dynamic and flexible battlefield strategy. Combined arms operations are designed to overwhelm enemy defenses by attacking from multiple angles and forcing the opposing force to constantly adapt. In the early phases of the counteroffensive, Ukrainian units worked closely with artillery and drone reconnaissance units to identify and target Russian defensive positions. The goal was to weaken entrenched Russian forces before sending in armored vehicles and infantry to exploit the gaps. This coordination, while challenging due to Russia's heavy use of mines and fortified positions, allowed Ukraine to make incremental gains in several sectors. A key element of these operations has been Ukraine's adaptation to the limitations of its military hardware. While Western nations have supplied advanced weapon systems, Ukraine's military had to integrate these tools into its existing Soviet-era framework. This created logistical challenges, but also forced Ukrainian commanders to develop innovative approaches to combined arms warfare. For example, Ukraine's use of drones for battlefield surveillance has been pivotal in directing artillery strikes with high precision, limiting Russian mobility and disrupting their defensive setups. Part 4. Challenges facing the counteroffensive. Despite the significant progress made, Ukraine's counteroffensive has faced numerous challenges. The most immediate obstacle has been the heavily fortified Russian defensive lines, particularly in the south. These defenses include layers of trenches, minefields, anti-tank obstacles, and pre-sighted artillery positions, which have made it difficult for Ukrainian forces to advance rapidly. Russian forces have also adapted their tactics, making use of their own drones, electronic warfare, and counter-battery fire to slow Ukraine's progress. The extensive use of mines has been especially problematic, as Ukrainian armored vehicles and infantry have faced repeated delays while clearing paths through minefields. These challenges have led to slower than expected progress in some areas, prompting questions about the overall success of the counteroffensive. Additionally, the Ukrainian military has had to balance its offensive operations with the need to defend against Russian attacks on other fronts. Russian forces have continued to launch missile and drone strikes on Ukrainian cities and infrastructure, forcing Ukraine to divert resources to air defense and critical infrastructure repair. This has put a strain on Ukraine's logistics and limited the number of troops and equipment available for offensive operations. Part 5. The role of Western support. One of the most significant factors shaping Ukraine's counteroffensive has been the level of support from Western nations. Since the beginning of the war, Ukraine has received military aid from a wide range of countries, including the United States, the United Kingdom, and members of the European Union. This aid has been crucial in sustaining Ukraine's military capabilities and providing the equipment needed for offensive operations. The counteroffensive has seen the deployment of a variety of advanced Western weapons systems, including HIMARS rocket systems, Leopard 2 tanks, and Bradley infantry fighting vehicles. These systems have provided Ukraine with a technological edge in certain areas of the battlefield, particularly in terms of long-range precision strikes and armored warfare. However, Western support has not been without its limitations. Many of the weapons systems delivered to Ukraine require extensive training to operate effectively, and Ukraine's military has had to rapidly integrate these new tools into its operations. This has created a steep learning curve for Ukrainian forces, particularly in the use of complex systems like advanced air defense platforms. Furthermore, there have been ongoing debates within Western countries about the scale and nature of the aid being provided. Some Western governments have expressed concerns about the long-term sustainability of military support to Ukraine, particularly as the war drags on. This has raised questions about whether Ukraine will continue to receive the level of support needed to sustain its counteroffensive over the long term. Part 6. The strategic importance of Crimea. One of the key objectives of Ukraine's counteroffensive has been to create conditions for the eventual liberation of Crimea, which has been under Russian control since 2014. Crimea holds significant strategic value for both Ukraine and Russia, serving as a critical base for the Russian Navy's Black Sea Fleet and a logistical hub for Russian military operations in southern Ukraine. Ukraine's counteroffensive in 2023 has included efforts to target Russian military infrastructure in and around Crimea. Ukrainian forces have used long-range missile strikes, including British-supplied Storm Shadow missiles, to hit key Russian military facilities in Crimea, such as airbases and ammunition depots. These strikes have disrupted Russian operations and demonstrated Ukraine's ability to project power deep into Russian-controlled territory. The strategic importance of Crimea cannot be overstated. For Ukraine, reclaiming Crimea would be a major symbolic and military victory, cutting off Russia's access to a vital military hub and weakening its ability to sustain operations in the southern part of the country. For Russia, the loss of Crimea would be a devastating blow, not only to its military capabilities but also to its political legitimacy, as the annexation of Crimea in 2014 has been a central pillar of Russian President Vladimir Putin's domestic and foreign policy. Part 7. Long-term implications of the counteroffensive. as Ukraine's counteroffensive progresses, its long-term implications for the war are becoming clearer. The success or failure of the counteroffensive will likely shape the trajectory of the conflict for months, if not years, to come. If Ukraine is able to achieve significant breakthroughs and reclaim large portions of its territory, it could shift the momentum of the war in Ukraine's favor, forcing Russia to negotiate from a position of weakness. A successful counteroffensive could also strengthen Ukraine's position in future peace talks, giving it greater leverage in determining the terms of any potential settlement. On the other hand, if the counteroffensive stalls or fails to achieve its objectives, it could lead to a protracted stalemate, with neither side able to secure a decisive victory. This could prolong the war indefinitely, with devastating consequences for both Ukraine and Russia. The counteroffensive also has broader geopolitical implications. The outcome of the war in Ukraine will have a profound impact on the security architecture of Europe and the future of NATO. A Ukrainian victory would send a strong message to other countries in the region, particularly those under threat from Russian aggression, that Western support can tip the balance in favor of smaller nations facing larger adversaries. Conclusion: Ukraine's counteroffensive in 2023 has been a critical phase in the ongoing war with Russia, shaping the battlefield and influencing the future trajectory of the conflict. Through a combination of strategic planning, Western support, and innovative military tactics, Ukraine has made significant progress in reclaiming its territory and weakening Russia's grip on occupied regions. However, the outcome of the counteroffensive remains uncertain, as both sides continue to adapt to the changing dynamics of the battlefield. As the war unfolds, the lessons learned from Ukraine's counteroffensive will have lasting implications for military strategy, geopolitics, and the balance of power in Eastern Europe. For now, Ukraine's resolve remains unshaken, and its forces continue to push forward, determined to liberate their homeland and secure a lasting peace.